All right, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started here. We've got quite a packed agenda. So welcome everybody. My name is Maura Egler. I am the Transit-Oriented Communities Project Manager at the Port Authority. I would just ask that if you could please introduce yourself in the chat. You can enter your name, and if you're affiliated with an organization, please include that as well. Or if you're a resident or just a South Hills Junction enthusiast, please feel free to include that as well. James, can you go to the next slide? So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. For participants that wish to use the ASL interpreters we have on the line today, you can click on the list of meeting participants and choose an interpreter by name. Click the interpreter's video and select the More button or 3 dots. Select Pin Video, and this will pin the interpreter's block to your screen along with any presentation that is being shared. Our interpreters today are Jim and Iris. They will alternate service times approximately every 15 minutes, and Jim will start today. We ask that you remain muted on your device throughout the presentation. If you dialed in by phone, you will need to press *6 to mute. The meeting moderator may mute participants throughout the meeting as necessary to reduce feedback. We encourage you to type questions or comments into the chat bar at any time. Please use the raised hand feature when possible, and we will be pausing throughout the presentation for questions and comments. And finally, this meeting is being recorded, and a copy of the video as well as the presentation will be made available on our project website. Next slide. So this is just our agenda for today, a little bit of a breakdown. We're doing the welcome right now, then we'll move into the presentation, which will last approximately 1 hour. We will be breaking at least once in there for some question and comment time. Then we'll be doing our interactive mapping exercise along with discussion. So that's where we'll be recording your questions and comments and feedback on our interactive mapping tool. And then we will wrap up and discuss next steps. So right now I'm going to turn it over to David Huffaker, our Chief Development Officer, to offer some welcoming remarks.
Thanks, Maura. Again, I'm David Huffaker, Chief Development Officer here at Port Authority, and I want to thank all of you for participating this morning. This is really an exciting part of the process. We've been working on the South Hills Junction station area plan for quite some time and have a number of exciting concepts that we're looking forward to showing you. What I want to emphasize is this is not a finished product, and that's why your participation today is so important. We're really looking forward to getting your feelings about how this site can best connect to the community and provide an asset and a connection to Port Authority service, as well as enhance the livability of the community. I'm not going to blather on for too long. I just want to thank you all for participating and know that this is part of a long process, but I'm excited about the concepts that you're going to see, and I'm looking forward to getting some of your feedback so we can make them better. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Next slide, please, James. Okay, so before we get into the designs, I just want to give a little brief intro on TOD as well as our transit-oriented communities team. So our TOC program plays several roles in encouraging transit-oriented development, or TOD, in Allegheny County. So TOD is development that's dense, mixed use, it's walkable, and of course it's close to high quality transit. And this is a picture of a local example we have in Station Square. Next slide. So the Port Authority plays 3 different roles in TOD. We can act as a sponsor for joint development on projects that are built on our property or connected physically or functionally to a busway or light rail station. We can act as a stakeholder for development that occurs within the half-mile radius of current or future stations. And we can act as an advocate for sustainable land use decisions along all of the Pittsburgh region's transit corridors. Next slide. So our TOC program consists of several areas and initiatives, including the TOD guidelines. These are created to provide stakeholders with best practices for TOD. They're meant to guide planning decisions around transit and serve as a reference for our partners. Next, we worked on TOD zoning. So we partnered with local municipalities and an organization called Connect to produce resources for zoning best practices that would encourage TOD. We have a first and last mile program, which provides support and advocacy for projects that help connect people to transit via other modes, such as biking and walking. And our station improvement program, what we're talking about today, is where we plan for upgrades to our current stations to promote ridership and transit access. And then finally, joint development, which I highlighted on the last slide. Next slide, please. So part of the TOD guidelines, they talk about these station typologies. So we classified our 69 fixed guideway or busway and T stations according to 6 different typologies, which are meant to kind of describe or characterize the station area by looking at the existing density and mix of uses surrounding the station. And based on that, make suggestions about the scale of development, including the amount of parking, building heights, density that is appropriate for that area. And when we talk about the station area, we're referring to the half-mile radius around the station itself. So according to the guidelines, South Hills Junction is a transit neighborhood station. These station areas are characterized by moderate density, a mix of uses, pedestrian accessible, but travel times can be longer than in high density areas. So it's a good idea to plan for a diverse range of transportation modes here so that people can reach low and mid density areas that are not within walking distance. So kind of a mid-range, mid-density neighborhood with still great access to transit. Next slide. So our station improvement program, the goal here is to invest capital resources in our light rail and busway stations in order to help encourage TOD. This started with a station evaluation to decide where there was the greatest opportunity in our system for TOD, which produced a priority list that we've been kind of working our way down and creating station area plans for each one of these. So far we've done 3 plans. The first was Negley Station. Construction is slated to start on that project in the fall. And we've also done Station Square and Dormont Junction, which are both currently going through the architectural design phase. And so South Hills Junction is our 4th station area plan. Next slide. So this is our website. That was just a very, very brief overview of everything we're working on. There's a lot of information here, so I encourage you to please visit this website and take a look at the many documents and past presentations that are on there. Next slide. Okay, so this is our presentation agenda, and I'm just going to kick us off with a summary of our first public workshop that took place back in May. So back in May, we did hold our first series of public workshops on this project where we collected feedback on the current conditions at the junction and heard ideas on how we might improve them. So just some highlights from those sessions. We heard a lot about neighborhood connectivity, or rather the lack of it. That's probably the biggest thing we heard. It was difficult to access the site for all users, particularly pedestrians and cyclists. ADA access is also a significant challenge at this site. We heard about neighborhood amenities, and in particular, the need for streetscape improvements, mostly along Warrington Avenue, in the form of lighting, wayfinding signage, plantings, etc. And then finally, we did also hear a lot about affordable housing, how the station area is in need of affordable housing, especially in any future residential development that might take place at South Hills Junction. Next slide. We also heard about the need for retail in the area that would complement the existing Warrington Avenue business district rather than compete with it. We heard about possible environmental contamination on the site, and we discussed what level of parking might be appropriate here. Next slide. So we used our interactive mapping tool to collect feedback, and it populated this map. So this is showing kind of the hot spots of where we received the most comments. So as you can see, the Haberman and Warrington intersection here was our biggest area where we received a lot of feedback about just access at that site in particular and challenges getting across Warrington. We also heard a lot about, as you can see, the station itself. We heard a lot about different improvements that could be made there. And just along Warrington Avenue generally, we heard a lot about access. As I said before, I can't emphasize that enough. Next slide. So this just shows sort of how many comments we received over time by category. We asked people to kind of divide their comments into several different categories. And this just shows you the breakdown over time during our community meetings that we received which kinds of comments. And then finally, this is just to give you a picture of kind of all the different ways we're able to present and analyze these comments that we received through Social Pinpoint. Another kind of pie chart breakdown of comments by category. Biggest one here is just general ideas and suggestions, but not far behind, again, is access challenges. We're able to see the different types of comments color-coded by category. And just pointing out, we did have positive comments as well. The great facility that should be noted, increase access to the station. This is talking about the Warrington Rec Center. So highlighting, some positive aspects of the community as well. And, our word cloud here that just shows us kind of the major key phrases that people are commonly using. But overall, we did receive a lot of great comments, and those comments have informed our proposed design that we're going to show you today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Owen to talk about the market assessment.
Mute. Good morning. Slight technical glitch. Thank you, Maura. I want to try to connect my comments very, very quickly. Next slide, Rich, to the things that Maura outlined. Is one of the obvious questions is why would you do a market assessment? And since a number of comments were generated specific to housing and maybe commercial or retail services, we'll want to jump into those points fairly quickly. But the overriding reason one would do this market assessment is clearly so that we can make economic and financial recommendations to the port that comport with the socioeconomic trends in the area, as well as the comments of those who've participated in these meetings. I think it is important to observe that while our data points to probable and highly supportable uses, ultimately how those uses get implemented will largely be a developer decision in concert with priorities established by the Port Authority. Next slide, James. There's some interesting data to quickly summarize that are reflected in our ultimate recommendations are the idea that there are some very, very strong distinctions between the north and the south area that are worth reflecting on. They help us understand the context in which the station will perform, and more importantly, they give us an idea about the particulars of the recommendations, again, hopefully matching what some of the residents or participants in these public meetings have said. One of the things that we thought was particularly curious were the very large differences in population density and the very large differences in housing units between the north and the south areas. In fact, the density of population is almost twice as high on the north side as it is on the south. So understanding that enables us to then make recommendations that match to those population characteristics. Next slide, please. The socioeconomic challenges, when you isolate them into those north and south areas, do point to some challenges, with the main one being about differences in income from the north to the south side. But at the same time, while there are some income challenges, I think it is worth observing that we've had some population increases, even though we haven't really had a major addition to the housing supply. In fact, the actual housing supply has been somewhat static. Next slide, please, James. James, can we switch slides? James?
Sorry, did that lag? I believe I've changed.
Oh, we have a lag. Okay. So while we're waiting for the slide to change, thank you. So while we're waiting for that slide to change, yeah, no, go back. Now you're too far, James. So I mentioned that the housing supply has been rather static, and you can see that by looking here at the north, the south, and the total. But what gives rise to our recommendations about housing is this static supply, the difference in values on the north and south sides of the study area, and our expectations about modest population growth. At least in general, we believe that the market could support around 300 housing units, which figures prominently into our recommendations and the physical plans that you're going to see today. Next slide, James. One observation that was shared repeatedly by those attending other meetings is that we don't really have enough services. And of course, services is a pretty broad construct, but we're able to collect and identify data that shows how neighbors, both on the north and the south side of the study area, spend their money. It's not really a surprise that probably close to 50% of a family's expenditures relate to food or food-related and dining activities, either in the home or outside of the home. At least based on these spending patterns, we believe that as much as 100,000 square feet of retail services could probably be supported, with maybe 35 to 45,000 square feet occurring in a more near-term time frame. What this chart illustrates is not just the share of those things, but at least the priorities about households and the way they allocate their spending. James, next slide, please. In the aggregate, the reason that we can support these services is not just because of the level of spending. It's about the level of spending that is drifting away to other neighborhoods, other locations, perhaps oddly enough, facilitated by being able to get on a train or a bus and go shop somewhere else. But this is at odds with our notion that these services should be immediate, proximate, available, and at least somewhat walkable. And the yellow bar or the golden bar, depending on your screen, indicates the level of extraordinary leakage, especially in the food and services category, that is drifting away, that might be captured locally. And by locally, we really mean at the station itself. Next slide, James. When you look at all of this together, we see, I think, three things. We see population density increasing somewhat, but housing not increasing as rapidly. We see a very old housing stock in various areas of the north and the south locations. We don't see that housing stock being replaced as rapidly as we believe it should be, and we see a great amount of leakage distributed to other neighborhoods and locations that could be serviced or supported locally. When we summarize all this, we're talking about a plan or plans, hopefully supported by the port, but then implemented by private developers in a neighborhood of around 300 units, with some components of that being affordable housing. Over time, there could be as much as 100,000 square feet of space supporting retail, commercial, and other types of service activities. These key uses, housing and commercial services, would then be supported by what we call public space and civic uses, perhaps a post office, meeting rooms, educational activities, those kinds of public services that often locate inside commercial activities. One reason we believe these particular recommendations are important, because at least historically, it's been the port's preferred strategy to work with developers on some kind of a ground lease, which assures a long-term control of that property by the port. Housing and retail, particularly rental housing, tends to work very well on a ground lease. That's it, James. Thank you. Next slide.
So before we move on to the design process, I wanted to kind of pause here and give people a chance to provide any questions or comments they might have on the market assessment portion before we move on. And you can feel free to just jump in or type something in on the chat. Oh, yes, Chris.
All right, having some issues with controls here. Just a real quick question. I think I may have missed this earlier on. The 300 units of housing you're referring to, and you say the market can support. When you say that, I infer you mean market rate housing. Is that correct?
It's a combination of both market and affordable. So at this stage, we haven't drawn sharp lines distinguishing those. I think it's fair to believe that a good portion of that might be affordable.
Okay, when you say the market can bear that, that's in terms of influx of population, for example, on the affordable side, tax credits available. I understand on the market side what you can support there, but.
Well, the 300 is based primarily on what typical developers might see as appropriate for a scale of development. So okay. We would rarely implement a project of less than 200 units. So there's a scale issue. But more importantly, in this case, there's a population issue, a housing age stock issue, a general need issue. If we're talking about price points, it is, in our opinion, the market can, in our opinion, support both market rate, if that's the port's preference, or affordable, if that's the neighborhood and the port's preference. And of course, having a developer respond, because ultimately, these will be cooperative decisions based on port criteria.
Right. Okay. Appreciate that. Thanks.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Owen. Any other questions or comments on the market assessment before we move on? Anything in particular regarding retail? Where, we have some uses that we sort of suspect might be appropriate here, but curious to hear kind of your thoughts on what type of retail might complement the Allentown Business District. We heard comments last time, that we didn't want to compete with that district, but rather complement and highlight it. So if there are any thoughts on.
Thank you, Maura, for adding it. I think that is important. So when we say we could support that much retail, generally speaking, that would be non-competitive. It means that much spending is to the exclusion of whatever else might be in other parts of nearby neighborhoods. So those areas and those facilities would still be supporting their respective complement of retail and services. If we had recommended in excess of 100, we in fact would be competing, because that's more spending that would need to be reallocated. So this is a level of support that is very consistent with that intended goal. And our actual near-term recommendation is shorter or smaller than that, to absolutely assure we're not competing with the existing stock of retail activity.
Yes, Norm.
I appreciate the analysis here based on probably hundreds and hundreds of neighborhoods. You have to understand, though, that this is a neighborhood that may not be in the peak of the curve of these wonderful projections. And having lived in this area practically all my life, there's a major problem on this Warrington corridor, and that is safety, perceived safety. There were a number of businesses here at one time, the Capitol Theater being one, small shops and stores. As population has changed, the safety has deteriorated dramatically, particularly in terms of personal safety, that is walking the street. You don't walk the street at night without looking behind you and be ready to run like hell. The Warrington Recreation Center was certainly a good centroid, but it also became, for a long period of time, a drug distribution center. So again, the overall averages are great to come in from the outside and say, well, this worked in average cities like whatever. This is not in the middle of your average. We have to look at the specifics of this site and take the generalizations and approach them specifically to the problems that are here and how can they be solved. Port Authority cannot solve all these problems. They have to be solved by the community.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I think, you know, we have a number of design options coming up that I think, you know, particularly along Warrington, streetscape improvements, that kind of thing that, you know, we have lighting improvements that we're proposing. So we definitely have public safety in mind when we're making these designs. So I think what you're going to see later on in the presentation, you know, might help with some of those issues just from a design standpoint. But appreciate those comments.
Yeah, I also appreciate them, and I think no sensible entrepreneur, no sensible store owner is going to respond in the absence of having the perception of safety solved. But to emphasize, Norm, these are not averages. These really reflect the dynamics of this neighborhood, but we must get those particulars under control.
Anybody else? Any more questions? We can talk about the market assessment at the end too. So this isn't your last opportunity.
Mara, I guess this is Aaron. I'll just say, I think it all depends on what sort of retail you're trying to get. I mean, because if you look at Warrington Avenue in the past decade, we've seen really nothing that indicates that crime and the rate of crime was any factor in businesses locating, any decision making around that, or commercial property reinvestment.
Got it. Yes, thank you for that. Definitely, I saw the article that 10 new businesses have opened up in Allentown just from the beginning of the pandemic. So clearly.
Right, and unfortunately, the crime rate in the past, in half of that was worse than it was in the same months over the prior 4 years. So, that's probably counterintuitive, but it is true.
Yeah.
Can I respond to that? You may be talking 4 years, but the population hasn't much changed over the past 30 to 40 years. And the businesses that left primarily in the 60s and the 70s when the crime wave got bad, and it hasn't much improved. Tremendous amount of racial problems, and lighting and other amenities aren't going to cure those. You have in a couple of adjacent neighborhoods that at one time were roughly middle-class neighborhoods, but the middle class has moved out to the suburbs, and now the population has dropped in income. Going to South Hills High School, which you have another picture there, it's an old age home now. Supposedly those of us who went to school there could move in. But at that time, the influence was far different from what it is today, and that was 30, 40 years ago. So you've got 30, 40 years of change. Somebody has to come up with it. And yes, improving the streets may do some, but all of your neighborhood studies are worthless if the population does not change, and if in fact the community doesn't change and say, we're not going to tolerate the crime that is here and seems to be permanent and chases people away, regardless of how pretty you make it look.
Well, I don't think I'm talking about aesthetics. I mean, I'm talking about the rate of new businesses. Allentown is actually only one of a handful of Pittsburgh neighborhoods that have seen population growth since the last census. So, I mean, crime is what it is, but you know, the other way to look at these business districts relative to the 60s and 70s is that because of the lower population, you know, these new businesses that are opening are looking at a customer base that comes from a wider commute or drive time, right? So we're not talking about people who walk a quarter mile as they were when the business districts were originally built pre-car. I mean, we're talking about people who are coming from, you know, within a 5-10 minute drive time.
Let's be realistic though, in an area like that, where are you going to park? These businesses don't drive, don't attract driving people. This is not a city that has people to drive into neighborhoods unless there's something unique. Again, having lived there most of my life, we never saw people driving into the neighborhoods. In fact, we see people driving out.
Well, why don't we move on to the design concepts where kind of some of these themes might come up again at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Maura. So I will begin into the design process that we've taken to develop what we have prepared for you today. We began our discovery phase with a kickoff site visit with the authority staff to learn about the ins and outs of the station area. With the information they provided, we were able to identify and collect opportunities and challenges within the station area, to which we were able to then present to the public back in May to confirm what we identified and to collect more information from those who were able to frequent the station more so than us. So after processing that data received by the authority and the public, we were able to begin our design process with the affirming of our guiding principles and the defining what we would like to see within each scenario. We conducted a series of internal design workshops to develop our working concepts and are now ready to present our solutions to you, the public, to confirm if our solutions that we present today are what the public feels are needed for South Hills Junction. The two scenarios that we'll present today are still being refined, as Dave spelled out in the beginning. So all input received from you will go into a final developed scenario, which will be presented later this year. Going into scenario A, junction renovated. This scenario addresses the short-term improvements to enhance the overall rider experience. Just some notes. While taking some of the key challenges outlined in our last presentation and developing less costly changes that can happen early with low impact on station operations. This scenario focuses on station platform design with proposed modifications to the station platforms and architecture. It addresses key access points to make the station more ADA friendly and emphasizes gateway opportunities, while allowing the authority's operations facilities to remain as is until market conditions become more favorable for major site development. We've prepared a diagram that highlights some of the key targets for this scenario, such as improvement to the Layla Street stair gateway signage, kind of creating that more of a gateway into the station itself. A full repair of the Jasper Street stairway, enhancements to the busway shelters to match architectural character of the LRT platforms. We would like to present a refresh of the LRT station architecture and platform accessibility. Removal of the redundant LRT structures just south of the active line. Rebuild and realign the path from East Warrington to create a truly accessible route with making pedestrian crossings safer at the top of that path. Create a new sidewalk from West Warrington and Haberman intersection with a marked crosswalk connecting to the Harwood Way stair. Replacement of the Montooth stairway. along with some initial streetscape enhancements along Warrington Avenue with creating more pedestrian-friendly crossings along that whole route. And then we're also highlighting within the station area is also some consideration of 2 parcels for future transit-oriented development. And parcel A, you can find up to 40,000 square feet of development where the existing salt shed sits today. And at parcel B has the development potential for an additional 80,000 square feet of space where the current rail tie laydown area exists. Moving on to our next slide, this is a rendered plan overview of what we'd like to propose in scenario A. Here we would like to create site enhancements along the existing retaining walls with art and lighting enhancements for protection and safety. A complete update to the Jasper Street stair for the southern Mount Washington access down into the station area. We'd like to complete general platform and structural repair to the LRT station area throughout enhancements to the architecture and the platform access. Create a wider architectural stair connection from Montour Stair, developing a direct gateway into the station area, using a combination of wide staircases and integrate landscaping features and resting points along the way down those stairs. A complete realignment and reconstruction of the walkway connection to the station area from East Warrington Avenue. This would establish a 5% walking trail down to the station, creating a more comfortable and accessible route, along with including resting points down that pathway. Complete initial streetscape enhancements along Warrington Avenue, including tree-lined streets and a protected bikeway, as well as widening sidewalks, while also providing additional parallel parking on the side of the station. As well as the intersection and gateway improvements at West Warrington and Haberman Avenues with new marked crosswalks, a pedestrian safety island to reduce crossing lengths, and new signage and streetscape amenities such as seating and lighting to promote this as a point of entry to the station area overall. And we'd like to incorporate a new ADA access point from Haberman Avenue connecting up to Sicane Avenue. This would introduce a new path to the station area from the east. And again, highlighted within this scenario are 2 parcels for future transit-oriented development. And I will now pass our presentation over to Elijah, and he'll discuss those opportunities for development.
Thank you, James, and thank you everybody who's joining us this afternoon. Back in 2016, I believe Maura mentioned this earlier, Port Authority developed their transit-oriented development guidelines. And what those guidelines did was several things. They organized all of the stations within the system by their TOD typology. And there are 6 types of TOD stations within those guidelines. The type of station that is South Hills Junction is the transit neighborhood station. This is an area that is primarily residential, but that is mid to high in terms of its density. And so, from the TOD guidelines, that it kind of sets some of the priorities for this station, in addition to what we've heard from the public at past public meetings and from what we've collected in the social pinpoint interactive map. And so some of those things are, we want to enhance multimodal access. We want to enhance the connection to the existing street network and throughout the neighborhood. And in terms of development, we'd be looking at things that are multifamily or townhomes at this site with about, a 70% lot coverage and going up to, 3 to 5 stories of development. And so these are 2 nearby examples that's an image of townhomes that are in Lawrenceville. It's a very efficiently organized development site. And so it does meet the kind of density goals that Port Authority has for its station areas. And then on the right is a picture of some of the development at East Liberty Station in East Liberty, where you have 4 to 5 floors of residential over 1 floor of retail and some parking underneath. So what we're looking at I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams for what we can fit on this site, just so that we can all have a general sense of what's possible here. These diagrams show size, shape, and configuration of potential development, but these are not design concepts. Design concepts would come, after Port Authority releases an RFP, and a developer would respond. Multiple developers would respond, each with their own kind of proposed configuration for the site, according to what they believe is kind of marketable and appropriate. So through this planning process, we will determine, what we'd like to see come from a developer in terms of affordability mix, in terms of the kinds of resources that they offer to the public and to Port Authority riders. And so these diagrams help us to understand what we might be able to fit on the site, how it might be configured, and how that can then feed back into the design process for Port Authority's assets. So what we're showing here in scenario A is really just these two sites on the eastern end where Port Authority owns property. Typically, when you start a design process like this, you would look at the zoning for the area. The area that Port Authority owns is currently not zoned for any kind of development. And so any development that occurs on this site would have to go through a zoning process to either adopt an existing zoning district or to create a special planning district, but that's well down the road. So what we're showing is really just looking at what's possible here. So if we were to populate those two parcels with townhomes in a similar kind of organizational strategy as to the image that I showed before, we'd be able to fit about 42 townhome units, each with its own parking on these two parcels. Next slide. Here's looking at it from the other side. So, this is a pretty deep valley, but these two parcels are on the upper end of the valley. So where the station area is still, it's quite a bit deeper into the valley. We believe that this kind of development is, appropriate for the context and is, appropriately scaled. Next slide. So we're also looking at, as I mentioned, the TOD guidelines suggest that, even higher density is recommended here. This is kind of a mid-level of density where we can go maybe 3 to 5 stories over a single floor of retail. And so here's approximately what that would look like here. And so still on the site where the salt storage building is, that would remain townhomes. That's kind of the easiest development strategy for that particular triangular shaped site. And then the two buildings along Warrington would be scaled approximately like this, set back from the street a little bit to give the street some room. And the buildings would have their own parking underneath, accessed from Warrington. Now, because of the way the valley is shaped, I think the bulk of the mass of the buildings would be kind of concealed from the neighborhood, as it would be on the backside of the development, just based on the way the valley slopes away. Thanks, James.
Sure thing. Next, we'll go into our second scenario, which is the junction reimagined. This scenario does take into elements into account from scenario A, but then builds upon that as well. So scenario B looks at developing a framework for a complete build out of South Hills Junction and how we can better tie together the neighborhoods of Belts Hoover and Mount Washington. This concept focuses on strategic reconstruction of the station area as well as the operational facilities and encourages development that will bridge the divide between the two neighborhoods. Looking at how the station could include a new multimodal platform to allow for bus and light rail, complete accessibility from all sides with the addition of an elevated walkway, and relocate some authority maintenance facilities to other locations, thus allowing for a new bus and light rail layover facility on site. Again, starting at a diagrammatic level for this concept, here we have a new access point from Layla Street to the proposed elevated walkway, which would join the two neighborhoods and create an ADA access point to the station area itself. Reposition the station platforms to allow for a new multimodal platform for both bus and light rail. Relocation of authority operational facilities west of the station for a new LRT and bus layover facility. Unification of on-street bus stops at the top of the Montour Stair along Warrington Avenue, and create a fully accessible promenade from East Warrington into the station area. We are proposing new intersection at Delmont Street for access into future TOD, as well as a complete streetscape design to meet with future TOD uses. We're going to reestablish access to the Mount Washington to include a path from Albert Street along with rebuilding the stair at Parr to connect to that new pathway. Improvement to the Harwood Way staircase and with authority standard lighting and signage to complement that improvement. And complete build out of development on the site for TOD, including the two previous parcels highlighted at the salt shed and the rail tie laydown area, but also include parcel C at the current bus layover area, which would add an additional 75,000 square feet of development to the South Hills Junction station area. And here we are looking at the rendered concept plan. Starting from the top, we have a new 5% walking trail connection from Albert Street leading to the base of the Harwood Way stair. This trail would utilize the historic rail alignment grade along the hillside with some slight alterations at the base of the Harwood stair to allow for this connection to be made. Reestablish the Parr Street stair, which would directly connect to this Albert Street trail connection, bisecting through it. Future stationary connection from Layla Street to TOD. This new pedestrian bridge would create an elevated connection between the two neighborhoods, as well as create an easily accessible connection to the station within the valley. Then realign station platform with a new shelter that can incorporate both light rail and bus. So this design would allow for the light rail to be situated along the outer sides. You can kind of see that highlighted in the red lines here of the platform, with the South Busway having an access from in between the two platforms. So it would be running down the center, utilizing both of those shelters for both transit modes. As part of the elevated walkway, we are proposing a new control tower, which will also be a vertical connection point from the bridge. So elevators and stairs at this point will allow anyone from the future TOD, Mount Washington, and Belts Hoover to have quick, easy access down into the stationary platform without having to use stairs. The proposed plaza at the base of that vertical connection will operate for users as a centralized place for gathering when waiting for transfers, as well as utilizing potential elements of the future TOD that could go in. This space will contain site amenities such as seating, lighting, and landscaped areas to provide shade and enhance site aesthetic. Next, leading down from East Warrington along the area line trail is a naturalized green infrastructure swell. As noted in our first public workshop, rainwater is currently being channelized behind the existing retaining wall and then filters out onto the walkway. The realigned walkway will include proper storm drainage under the walkway, but also be able to transfer into a swale, helping collect and filter this runoff. As we look to encourage more development on site, we believe a new vehicular access point at Delmont should be incorporated with the marked pedestrian crossings and bump outs. To centralize bus operations, we're also proposing a new bus layover loop, which can hold up to 5 articulated buses and provides as a bus stop to replace the existing one at the control tower. Then lastly, we believe that Harwood Way stair is also able to be improved through reconstruction to allow for the elimination of the tread variation as you walk down those stairs, and allow for, again, the Albert Street access trail to utilize the same break in that retaining wall there. Just to kind of zoom in so we can examine these areas a little bit more, we wanted to first highlight what we have here at the station area plaza. Here you can see that we have that repositioned control tower and how it can operate the vertical movement for the proposed elevated walkway, so that's containing those stairs and elevator down to the station platform. Following those red lines on the screen, we can also see how the light rail will operate on the outer sides of that new platform, with the South Busway bisecting the platforms themselves for their connection to the new multimodal platform. We can also see a clearer view of the enhancements made to the Montu stair connection and how a wider stair with a mix of vegetation will create a more pleasant gateway down into the station when accessed through there. And then lastly, we can see the realigned 5% walkway down to the station coming from East Warrington Avenue. This access point will incorporate new railings, lighting, art featured on retaining walls, green infrastructure systems to reduce rainwater runoff, as well as a braking and resting points with seating along the path itself. Then next, we just wanted to zoom to the improved intersection at Warrington and Haberman. We are proposing wider sidewalks at all points before crossings, as well as pedestrian island within the intersection to allow shorter times within that roadway. There are clearly marked striping for pedestrians to follow and other site enhancements also being proposed at this intersection, such as new signage, lighting, and street furnishings. And now again, I'll pass it back to Elijah just to talk about the development opportunities shown for scenario B.
Thank you, James. I did see a couple of comments in the chat. So James, could you go back to the overall overview and I'll see if I can just quickly talk about those. So there would be pickup and drop off. We're still figuring out exactly how that would work. And I'm referring to pickup and drop off from passenger vehicles. And so we would be looking at doing that somewhere along Warrington, either where the existing path is, that ramp right there. That would be one location for potential pickup and drop off, or near the steps, the Montu Street steps, where there could also be an elevator, or at least access to one for accessible pickup and drop off as well. So I'm really excited about the possibility here. This is a bit of a dream for this station. One thing that is particularly exciting about the station platforms in this arrangement is that when you're standing on the inbound platform, either a bus or a light rail vehicle can come and pick you up and take you into town. Just hop on whichever one comes first. Same thing with the outbound platforms. It makes it a lot easier to use all of the different modes of transit that are available to you at this station area. Let me just take a quick peek at the chat. And the access point to the north, that accessible connection up to Albert Street and to Harwood Way, that as somebody noted, that is a part of Mount Washington whose access to the station area has been limited since those Parr Street steps were taken out of service. And so, there is a bit of a level of effort to make that connection happen. But I think that as a part of the overall strategy, this is definitely in that scenario B vision to bring back connectivity and to make it, accessible. So I'm gonna move on, and we can address some of these other comments at the end of the presentation, because there's a lot of good discussion items here. So, when you reconfigure the station area and reconfigure some of the operational assets that Port Authority has at this location, it opens up this development parcel. It's marked with an A here. And that is it's a larger parcel than the other two. It's a very vertical parcel because the valley is quite deep at that location. But when you rearrange the operational assets that the Port Authority has, the layover areas and the station area, this becomes a viable site for potential development. Now, because it is a very deep part of the site, it requires that we build to a higher level of density in order to support the construction costs. And so we would be looking at kind of a mid-level of density, mid-rise density, as we saw in option 2 for scenario A at this location. And so there could be a situation where the development on the eastern 2 parcels remains at a lower density. They remain townhomes, but that this parcel that is right next to the station area would be at a higher level of density. And again, given what we learned from the market analysis and given the TOD guidelines, we're looking at primarily a residential development. But again, it could have some ground floor retail or some other non-residential uses at this location. And it would also have kind of parking that is concealed below grade. So it would be available, but it wouldn't necessarily have a visible presence on Warrington Avenue, at least not a distracting one. Next slide. Again, this is a really deep part of the valley. And so looking at it from the backside, it appears to be quite a bit taller than it does from the Warrington Avenue side. But given that, it's across the valley from the neighborhood, it's behind trees, it's kind of in the space where the Port Authority's junction takes place, it's not necessarily out of scale or out of context. Next slide. So here's the kind of maximal development density, looking at the 4+1 or 5+1 residential over non-residential development across the whole site. The one that's labeled D, that is where the salt shed is today. It's a more complicated site because it's triangular in shape, but we can indeed fit a development of similar size and shape to what's on the screen now. And so this is what it would look like with that level of development across the site. Next slide. So, the design process is it's kind of a funnel of ideas, and we filter through, a whole bunch of ideas, and we go from what's possible closer to what's probable. And then once we kind of have an understanding of what's probable, which is what we're showing here, we want to better understand from the community and from all of you and from the experts we have on the team, what's preferred. And so that's where we'll kind of go next. Next slide, James. So there are a couple of design principles that we've been thinking about throughout the design process. Next slide. And so we compare those kind of design principles, and I can talk in greater detail about what we mean by each of these. But we assess the existing condition according to these principles. And then, in scenario A, we're trying to make improvements. And then in scenario B, we're trying to make the best situation possible. So for the station area, we care about accessibility. We care that there's modal parity so that, bus riders and light rail riders have equally accessible and equally pleasant amenities on site. And we care about visibility. So in scenario A, we can make improvements at key locations to accessibility. But in scenario B, we can make all the access points fully accessible because we'll be really reworking the site. With regard to modal parity, giving bus riders and making the bus system as visible and easy to use as the light rail system. In scenario A, we would be looking at improved bus platforms. In scenario B, we'd be fully reconfiguring the station area so that buses and light rail share the same platforms. With regard to making the station visible and making it feel active and like a safe and usable part of the community, in scenario A, we can improve visibility by improving signage. And so I think that's something that we discussed in greater detail at the first public meeting. But Port Authority, working with the GAI team, is working on a wayfinding project specific to this station area. And so improved signage will make it easier to see the station and how to use the station and how to access it. But in scenario B, we'll be able to really reconfigure the site. And Port Authority, working with a developer, can kind of orient the station access points to make it really easy to see where the station is from the community and how to access it, and how to make it really a part of both the Mount Washington and Belts River neighborhoods. Again, with regard to access, this is referring more to the street network. We care about safe intersections, and we care about a lively streetscape. We know that many of the intersections in the area are unsafe. They feel unsafe, they are unsafe. And so in scenario A, we would be looking at tactical improvements to improve safety. Things like making the crosswalks more visible, adding signage, and improving lighting, and even reorienting some of the curb lines and some of the sidewalks to make it easier to cross the street. In scenario B, we can be more ambitious about reconfiguring the intersections to really prioritize the safety of people crossing the street. With regard to making a lively streetscape, in scenario A, we can improve signage throughout the area and clean up the sidewalks, make them wide enough, make sure that they're in good condition. But in scenario B, a developer and the Port Authority and the city could all kind of work together to reimagine how West Warrington Avenue and East Warrington Avenue are configured at this location to make the streetscape safe, inviting, and really a vibrant part of the community. So we showed two different scenarios for development. Scenario A, looking primarily at residential, there would be 50 to 125 units. Scenario B, about 150 to 275. Now, a developer could push that even further. Our market study suggests that we can fit about 300 units of housing on this site, and that the market would be able to support that. And that's even including assumptions about providing affordable housing and making sure that the housing is attainable to people at all income levels. But also scenario B, we can fit in a bit more of non-residential uses as well. And this could be retail, this could be community spaces, this could be something like a daycare near transit. From an operational standpoint, there are a lot of operational facilities at this location, some of which would need to be relocated off-site. Of the ones that would stay on site and that are really important to have at this location are the light rail layover facilities and the bus layover facilities. Right now, there are 2 spaces where light rail vehicles can lay over, and we have room for 3 buses to lay over. And that would not change in scenario A, nor would we add the ability for battery electric bus charging stations at this location. When we reconfigure things in scenario B, that's where we would be expanding the bus layover capacity just a little bit. That opens up a lot of operational capability for the Port Authority, but it would also allow us to add in some battery electric bus charging facilities as well. And there's the potential to expand the layover capacity for the light rail vehicles, which would both save the Port Authority money in operational costs, but it would also make it easier for Port Authority to serve downtown, the stadiums, and the neighborhoods during rush hour and during events. We also noted that from an operations standpoint that, under certain conditions, particularly detours, Port Authority has to put flaggers at the intersection of the South Busway and the light rail tracks. And so those flaggers cost additional money. And so we can make improvements to the signaling or reconfigure that intersection to make it easier and safer for vehicles, Port Authority's vehicles, to move through the junction. I'll hand it off to Rich now.
Thank you, Elijah. I'll quickly go through the timeline so we can leave plenty of time left to respond to some of the chat comments and any additional comments you may have. But just quickly, I wanted to let you know where we have been coming from here. We did meet with some of you folks back in May for our first round of public engagement when we held our initial workshops. At that time, we did a lot of desktop reviews, researching information online and previous studies. We also did a handful of site tours, including a bicycle and pedestrian safety audit. We did summarize that material, our sort of understanding at the time, and presented that. As summarized by Maura earlier, a lot of the feedback we got back in May was related to neighborhood connectivity and site amenities, need for affordable housing, and discussions of possible retail and parking components to the site. As David had noted as well, we are not complete. As you can see in the timeline, we're pretty much in the middle of the project here. Over the next couple of months, we will take your feedback and that from other stakeholders and we will advance towards a single preferred concept design, taken to around a 10% design level. We will then hold another round of public engagement in about 3 months to present the preferred alternative before moving forward with developing our actual station area plan over the holidays. And we're targeting January for completing the final report and plan. With that, we'll turn it over to Maura, and please feel free to type your questions in the chat, or you could raise your virtual hand, or let us know what other questions you may have.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everybody. We have some great comments in the chat. I just want to share quickly with you a link to our project homepage. This features several opportunities to provide feedback after the meeting or during the meeting if you want to. But we have 2 interactive maps this time, one for each scenario, and they're very detailed in terms of just highlighting all the different proposals within each scenario. So feel free to revisit that, take a look at it, comment, add your comments to it. We have, again, one for each scenario. We also have an ideas wall, which is more of a forum kind of format where you can add comments based on a topic. So I just wanted to point out that we have several different ways to provide feedback even beyond this meeting. So yeah, I mean, let's jump into the chat. I think we've got a lot of great discussion going on here. Karen, did you want to start somewhere, or?
Well, I did see that Elijah just wanted to quickly answer the parking question, but I think maybe we should go to that and then talk about how, I know Melissa has raised some issues about how this is sort of an equitable solution to all the communities. So I thought we might go from one to the other, but I thought maybe Elijah could address the parking issue.
Yeah, thank you. So we showed in kind of a gross quantity how much parking can fit on the site, and that's not based on a specific parking ratio. Rather, it's based on physically what can we fit on this site if we do it, below the level of Warrington Avenue. And so, I think that in the future, we're going to tailor any recommendations about parking very, very specifically to what is actually needed. Port Authority, will probably not include a parking minimum when they put out a request for proposals from developers. Rather, I think we'd like to recommend a parking maximum based on a ratio of parking spaces to number of units, parking spaces to amount of non-residential uses. I think it is important to keep in mind, money spent on parking is money spent not making the housing units affordable. It's money spent not making the retail units affordable for small businesses. And so we definitely want to make sure that development on this site will be very exacting and precise with the amount of parking that needs to be built with it.
Elijah, I'd like to add to that as well. Being in the city of Pittsburgh, we certainly would consider their zoning requirements for parking, but working with city staff, they actually encourage designers to install the least amount of parking as possible. And we can do that here through alternative parking mitigation plans. Certainly with all the multimodal improvements we are making in the area, we can take credits for parking. So as Elijah had mentioned, we can actually install less.
Great. I thought we could maybe have Melissa mention some of her comments. She talked both about access from communities, but also a sort of the kind of equitable solution that this poses for the neighborhoods. Melissa, do you feel comfortable talking about some of your issues in the chat?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, you can't hear me. I am a Democratic committee woman in the area. I've been a Democratic committee woman for over 26 years. So I am familiar with this area. We have been cut off from access to the bottom of Westwood Street, handicapped, ADA accessible. At one time, we hoped for TRID development for the South Hills residents, the retirement residents. But now that I see scenario B, I think this has great potential because of the Skyway, the ADA access, the elevators, the potential for residents of Beltsuver and Mount Washington to either ingress, egress across to Warrington Avenue. I believe that opens up those bridgeways. I'm a community engagement. I have my PhD in community engagement. So I see potential. Scenario B is potential because it opens up, it reopens the access. If you see, I'm looking at the slide where Parr Street is, which is now, we are cut off at that access, okay? Right above that, where I say Westwood Street, there's the trail. You all are saying Albert Street. There's in Mount Washington East, there's Lower Albert and Upper Albert. But Westwood Street is what really connects that. We've been cut off from that access point. So you would reopen that, and that potentially for your development on that platform, if you have businesses, you open up that development for all of those Mount Washington people to access now. And that brings in potential dollars for anything that you bring to the busway. Same thing across Warrington Avenue, your proposed stairway down further on Warrington Avenue, you are giving Beltsuver more access. Yes, right there. And I use the cut through here on Haberman Avenue, which has been a dangerous intersection for many, many years. So at the corner of Haberman, when you have safety in mind, and that's at the forefront, personal safety, public safety, you open up the communities. So it's equitable solution for everyone, both right. Beltsuver and Mount Washington. So I'm just excited. I'm probably all over the board here, but that's where I think scenario B, number one, finally opens up the access for us in Mount Washington, because we've been cut off from the station for far too long. And finally, Beltsuver, our friends in Beltsuver will have easy access.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing those comments.
Well, thank you for letting me, allowing me my rambling.
No. I think it was all around that theme that you were talking about in the chat. And I noticed that Ellie had a question about bike access. Speaking of access, I don't know whether Elijah or James, you want to talk about how bike access to the station was considered.
Aaron, I can cover that one quickly. Certainly improving both the ADA connections to the station via the 2 ramps shown in the figure there. That will allow for improved bicycle access to the station. And we will plan on including some bicycle amenities within the station area itself as well. Obviously, we have control over design of bicycle elements within the Port Authority's property. And although we sort of lose that control as you leave and further go into the public realm, I did want to note that within the city of Pittsburgh's bicycle master plan, they do have proposed improvements in the future along Warrington Avenue that we would certainly connect to as well.
Great, thank you. At the end of the discussion that Owen presented on the market analysis, I know Maura asked the question, the prompt about what kind of retail people would like to see. And I know Janet asked that question in the chat, sort of what kind of retail is imagined here. And Jules, I believe that you wrote about having some incentives for neighborhood businesses. So I just wonder about those of you, Norm, Jules, Janet, all the people from Melissa in the area, thinking about what kind of retail you might imagine here. Sort of an open-ended question for any of you who'd want to address that.
Okay, Norm, I'd like to comment on those businesses that used to be there. Obvious life has changed. But what we had before was a couple of small grocery stores. We had a flower shop. We had a shoemaker shop. Not that anybody knows what that is anymore. There are a number of small stores. And as an example, somebody mentioned Lawrenceville. You go out through the old section of Lawrenceville, you see a variety of like bistros. You see maybe a bake shop would do cake decorating. People don't always go to Sam's Club to get cake anymore. And if you're talking small shops, they have to have a certain amount of character to them. The business of having large block buildings down there in the junction, just step on that for a minute, it's terrible. It's terrible. It's very sterile. You put small shops in those, they have no character. Up along Warrington, we could have some small shops with character. There's an elderly community up there where people would love to come out and sit and chat for a little bit in a sheltered place. The businesses, it's always a difficulty where to put the business. At the intersection of Warrington and Arlington Avenue used to be a centroid. When the old incline came up there, of course, that would make it very, very busy. There have been a number of tries to have businesses up there, but again, we talk about safety. It's also police action. Quite frankly, we have a black-white problem that continues in the neighborhoods around this area. And until we get some of that sorted out, many of these small businesses are going to struggle. But yet the small businesses, yeah, that's the kind that we need.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Janet, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I'm just a private citizen that remembers, I went to St. Justin High School, and a lot of my classmates came in from Beachview, Brookline, Dormont to go to school there. And that was the drop off. And they took the stairs up, and it's Leolia Street, up Leolia Street to school. And one of the things I remember there, and I hope that maybe they'll bring it back, they had kind of like a combination candy store and snack shop. And lots of times, either before or after class, or maybe if you had a long enough break in between classes, you'd go down there and you could get a burger, or you could just, you know, get a pop. And that might be something that we might think about putting back in there, just because while you're waiting for the bus, maybe you're thirsty and you want a cold drink, or maybe you just want a little snack to tide you over till you get home. Might be something to think about.
What was the name of that store?
Pardon?
I know I interrupted. What was the name of that store? I had that question come up last week. I can't remember the name of that store.
I don't know. I know on Ruth Street there was a little store, and I think it was called Moe's.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about right down there in the junction.
Right, right.
There used to be a little place.
Well, thank you for that. We'll have to put out a little survey, like, do you remember, right?
Yeah.
May I say something?
Yes,
it's
please.
Melissa.
And then I want to go over to Dave Totten after Melissa. Thanks.
I would just, my idea is a convenient, something at the onset, something a convenience that Mount Washington people or anyone using the junction, if they want a cup of coffee, if they want something to drink, but I would rely on maybe the Hilltop Alliance for any type of needs survey. So I would want to see, what do the folks in Beltsuber need? What would the folks in Mount Washington like to see? So I would rely first at the onset of what the needs would be of the riders, who is using the buses in the T, and what they would need while they're standing waiting for the bus, and then grow from there. But I think when I'm standing waiting for public transit, I'm usually thirsty, or on the way home, I forgot to grab bread or I need something to go home, something of that mindset. But that's my quick thought.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Well, we have Aaron Sukanik from the Hilltop Alliance on here, and I see.
I saw that. That's why I said maybe we should. Yeah, he should have a needs assessment.
Aaron, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we could definitely work on closer to the time, you know, coming. I think you would also want to work in tandem though with what a broker or developer believes are feasible tenants as well, you know, just so we can marry desire with reality.
Great, thank you. I see some specific comments from Trent, but I also wanted to go back to Dave Totten, who's had a bunch of different comments along the way. But Dave, you were just talking about a grocery store, for example, and I think you had some other comments. I wonder if you wanted to share.
Oh, I'm not sure that's totally necessary. I think you guys are definitely having a great conversation here. I know in the past we talked about maybe having with the smart TRID project from a bunch of years ago now, a lot of years ago now, putting in something like a Target or something gigantic like that. And I think this is much more scaled to what could really happen and could make a really much bigger difference to the neighbors in the neighborhood. This is good stuff.
Great, thank you. Trent, I wanted to ask you you had some specific questions about, I think the stop sign, with the development of these parcels, whether there might be a stop sign or traffic light at Haberman and Warrington. I just wondered if you could talk about your comment here, and then maybe Elijah or James or Rich, if you could talk about the traffic perspective, or Todd.
Yeah, sure. I live up on Utah Street, so I'm basically, the tunnel goes under our driveway here. But driving down Haberman can really be a nightmare when it comes down to turning left on Warrington, especially. And I'm thinking if those properties are developed, having this added traffic go down to where the existing junction is could just increase traffic enough to the point where maybe a stop sign or a traffic light is warranted there. Not sure.
So Rich or James or Todd,
yeah,
if you want to.
That's something that would be evaluated as the actual site components become further defined. There are standards for warranting traffic signals, and usually they're based upon traffic volume. So as you noted, if they do increase in the area, the intersection could at some point trigger installation of a traffic signal.
I have a quick comment on that. I still don't, even with future development, I don't understand why the city PennDOT hasn't collaborated with the Port Authority to put a signal there. That was just a stream of consciousness, only because of the weird intersection there. Yeah, and the sight line.
Traffic signals are based upon a very analytical method.
Volume.
Yeah, they're calculated, and it's based upon not just a PennDOT guidelines. They're actually federal guidelines used across the country. So, yeah, normally based on volume.
Thank you.
But crash histories could be considered as well.
Rick, I'd like to comment. Those are guidelines, and any municipality can override those with no problem. I teach courses on that, and I understand where you're coming from. But that intersection is a typical Pittsburgh intersection. You don't know where you're going, and you don't know what you can do. So yes, more needs to be done. But
thank you. Thanks for that.
Aaron, I've got one more.
Sure. And then I want to go to Chris for his comment, but please, Norm.
Okay, a major comment on this whole development, and this is a statement was made, I think, by Elijah in the first place. You put maintenance someplace else, and this to me is one of the biggest tragedies of bringing in outside people that don't know the neighborhood and don't know the system. Where is that someplace else? If putting that maintenance someplace else is not part of the study, then your study is incomplete. After all, that maintenance is necessary to keep the streetcars, the trolleys, and the buses running down through the tunnel. Now, where would that maintenance go? What does that maintenance do? It's rail storage, it's salt storage, and so on and so forth. I lived over there for 13 years, and we fought constantly where to do maintenance. And we were constantly pushed out of where. We didn't know. And then we would have trucks we didn't know what to do with. We had rail we didn't know what to do with. So that needs to be part of the study. And if it's not part of the scope of work, there's something wrong. We need to have that included. And understanding from the operators and owner standpoint, not just necessarily was something we did over in East Podunk because it seemed to work. So yes, I'm being rather strident, but it is a big issue. Please do not push that out.
Sure. I know that, Elijah, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I know there's been discussion about other opportunities.
Sure. So everything that we do as a part of the station improvement program is coordinated with a committee inside the Port Authority called the Transit Communities Committee. And there are folks from maintenance, engineering, operations, safety, who attend those meetings and who are deeply involved in helping to steer this project. With regard to maintenance facilities on this site, there are a lot on this site. And a part of that is, this whole valley has been, a kind of transit junction for really as long as it's been developed. And so, a lot of the facilities in this valley actually date back to the Pittsburgh Railways Company. And several of the buildings further down in the valley are actually original to the Pittsburgh Railway Company. And they were inherited by the Port Authority when the Port Authority was created. And so part of what that means is that, a lot of the maintenance facilities that are here were kind of afterthoughts. They weren't thought about deliberately according to what Port Authority needs in order to be able to maintain their vehicles, to be able to maintain their assets. And so in many cases, a lot of the facilities here are undersized or don't have the utilities and capabilities that they need to be able to maintain the system as it is. And they're definitely not prepared in the eventuality that Port Authority, if Port Authority would like to expand their system. Now, the salt storage, so the rail tie storage, that can go pretty much anywhere along the rail alignment. And we have been helping the Port Authority to think about sites where that could go and go and bring along, kind of better facilities for them to be able to provide those services to the system. The salt storage is a little bit of a different question. That wants to be located anywhere near the busway system. We have 3 busways, south, east, and west. And the way it is now is we have one giant one, except that one giant one isn't necessarily well located for the west busway or the east busway, and it's not necessarily large enough to serve all 3. And so we would be, we've been helping them to think through other locations throughout the network where salt storage could go, given that this isn't necessarily the best context for it. When there is a storm event, all you hear is dump trucks, backup beepers, and bulldozers moving the salt around at this location in residential contexts. So we are thinking about these things.
Well, let me respond. I agree with you on the salt storage. Was put there. That, by the way, it goes before Pittsburgh Railways. That was the site of the original Castle Shannon #1 incline. But in terms of those maintenance facilities, unless you're actually talking with the people that are doing the maintenance, not just necessarily supervisors down at 6th Avenue, you're getting a completely different issue, because I work there and I know what's going on. And maintenance was always pushed over in a corner, and it has to be considered by the people that work in maintenance. And maintenance will live with anything that they're given, whether they're efficient or not. They just do what they're given. But again, to come in from the outside with a high-minded attitude that, again, most of the consultants come in and say, we know about maintenance, but if you have not worked in maintenance, you have not done it, quite frankly, you don't know it. So I'm objecting strongly, because I worked in maintenance. I know what it is. So I'm going to get off my high horse.
Norm, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate your comments. We're actually a few minutes over time. I'm going to turn it over to Maura in a minute. I know that Maura wants to address Chris Sandvik's question about will the infrastructure improvements happen before a developer comes forward, or how that works. So I'm going to turn it over to Maura now to address that and bring us to a close and talk about other ways that we can keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everybody for a great conversation. I just wanted to quickly respond, Chris Sandvik, to your question. And also this kind of relates back to what we were just talking about, but one of the suggestions that sort of came out of the Next Transit long-range plan is the need for a facilities master plan, which is where we would basically take a look at all of our assets and kind of determine what we have and, if we need to expand, where that's possible. And so all these conversations that you're talking about in terms of moving the salt shed, moving these, rail tie laydown areas, that's something that we're definitely thinking about and talking about, and we'll be doing, in fact, a whole sort of planning process around that for our entire system. And so that leads into Chris's question of kind of, are we going to, invest in infrastructure before development happens? I think obviously, first of all, we need to figure out where the stuff can move first. That's the biggest question. But then I think it's fair to say that we would certainly be making improvements to South Hills Junction station. Whether as part of a state of good repair, maybe more than state of good repair, I think we're certainly looking to make those station improvements, but some of the larger sort of concepts that you see in scenario B, I think, are dependent on development. So, that's not like a definite answer, but I would say that we definitely want to do something here, whether there's a big, scenario B situation or not. But I just wanted to thank everybody and kind of bring us to a close here. This was a really great conversation. And as I mentioned, we have the 2 interactive maps as well as the forum that's called an ideas wall on our website. And I urge you to kind of continue the conversation. Thanks, James. This is our homepage. This is what it looks like. And if you scroll down, you can see all the opportunities. Oh, that's the old page. It should be loaded now, but all the maps are there as well as the idea as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And also tomorrow from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Warrington Rec Center, we're having actually an in-person open house. So I encourage you to stop by if you have time. We're gonna have all these projects on big boards. We're gonna have some fun giveaways for people. So if you're available tomorrow from 4 to 6, we'll be at the Warrington Rec Center. So thanks so much, everybody. And I hope you learned something, and thanks so much for participating today.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
By the way, it's pronounced Lilia Street.
Thank you.
Lilia Street.
I am so glad you said that, Norm, because we've had that question. I've talked to a few people. I got a couple answers, and now I'm going to write that phonetically for us.
Lilia.
Lilia. I'll remember it.
It's a Mount Washington thing.
Yes. Yeah.